Asia is an economic powerhouse, but is it ready to innovate? Will its culture, education systems, and politics stimulate or stifle a generation of creative entrepreneurs? The premise of the Singapore sessions is simple. Take a global business challenge and bring together experts from diverse fields to share their solutions. And in this Singapore session, training and education in Asia, the region's future is riding on it. Will the next generation be prepared to build innovative and creative corporations and societies? That is the challenge. For their solutions, we'll hear from Craig Barrett. He was the CEO and chairman of the board of global chip giant Intel. He is an advocate of education and competitiveness around the world. William Overholt is a senior research fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Previously, he was a strategist for Asian banks. Among his books, The Rise of China. Dr. Victor Zhao is the Chancellor for Health Affairs at Duke University and the president of its medical center. He helped establish Singapore's first medical school. Sir Martin Sorrell heads WPP, considered one of the most dominant advertising companies operating in Asia. He's also the governor of the London Business School and a member of the board of the Indian School of Business. I am pleased to have them here to talk about this very important subject, and I begin with Craig Barrett.
If you look at international competitiveness today, it's really made up of three pieces: education of your workforce, investment in new ideas, that's research and development investment, and then setting the right environment for smart people to do smart things with those ideas. This is a challenge every country has, the United States, Asia, Russia, wherever you are. Challenge in the United States is, are we doing enough? The challenge in Asian countries is, are they doing enough? And I think the real issue here is how well you're educating your workforce, and then how much of your GDP you're going to put into R&D, creation of new ideas. We've been educating Asians for a long time. Most of our graduate schools of engineering today are filled with Asian products, coming here, getting the graduate education and going back. There's no question that they're very capable students, that their undergraduate education is good, because they're succeeding here in the best graduate education system in the world. The issue is, how fast will they build up their graduate education system to be competitive with the U.S.?
William?
East Asian countries have done a marvelous job of providing basic education. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, Singapore. Everybody gets a good basic education, particularly in the hard sciences. How they'll do in the future depends on other things. In Japan, they've turned inward. They're losing the cosmopolitan global perspective. They just graduated the first class that has never experienced, a university class that has never experienced 1 year of good growth. The energy, the hopefulness is gone. South Korea, on the other hand, is the rising star of Asia. They've liberated women for the workforce. They've globalized. They've brought in the labor they need. Moving fast. China's doing all the right things, but it's a generation behind at least. And the question there is whether the money and the legal system are going to support small, innovative companies that will create jobs and new technology. Right now, everything is pretty much the big state enterprises. India is a completely different story. They educate an elite very well, very competitive. From the middle on down, they fail. Half of all Indian women end up illiterate, a third of the entire society. The bottom part of India is worse off than sub-Saharan Africa. So they're headed for terrible strains. World-class companies impressing all of us, and tough social times ahead.
Victor?
Well, you know, I have a perspective of being an immigrant. I was born in China, Shanghai, and came when I was 18 to go to college and then medical school. And then since the last number of years, since at Duke, we've been doing a lot of initiatives, including, as you said, starting a medical school, which, by the way, is not the first, the second, but a different model of medical school of Singapore. So when you think about Asia, because Asia is very big, and so as Bill and others pointed out, you're looking at which country. But I guess most of us think about where the major population is, where the economy is, which is China, India, Singapore, and Japan. And from that perspective, I think about clearly that as an Asian, education is core value for Asians. So that's not an issue. It's what we teach the students, and how do we teach, can you teach innovation? It's the environment. It's also, as Richard Florida wrote in his book, it's a social tolerance as well. So these things, I think, what makes us innovative society. So when I think about Asia, we think about U.S. as a place where we teach innovation and creativity, but Asia, more hardworking, getting the job done. But I think that's changing. And it's changing quite a bit. From my own experience in Singapore, if you look at what Singapore is doing, it's creating these international partnerships with many universities. Duke is one, but so is MIT. So I think that increasingly, also in China, where they're investing a lot into the big universities, you can see that they're introducing new pedagogical methods of teaching and creating a whole cadre, I think, in the future of innovative individual.
Martin?
Well, I think it'd be extremely arrogant of us in the West to believe that these massive population concentrations, it might well be 1.5 billion in China, 1.1, 1.2 billion in India, are not going to produce, during the course of time, companies. If I take our own industry, I mean, you indicated we have a very strong position in most all of the Asian markets, stretching from Japan through to Australia, New Zealand, from north to south. But it would be very arrogant of us to believe that that's not going to change. I just came back from Beijing a day or so ago, and we went into some detail into the 12th five-year plan. If you look at that, what are some of the messages? Well, consumption is going to increase, greater focus on service as well as services industry as well as manufacturing, greater emphasis on cultural balance growth, cultural values, values of education, importance of education. I think our biggest competitors are not going to be our traditional competitors based here in the United States or in Western Europe, France, for example. It's going to be from indigenous talent in China and India. Singapore, as has been said, has attracted universities, it's attracted talent. My bet would be that Singapore will be the home of a major Western multinational corporation within 5 years, because as the center of influences move to the east, and indeed to the south, to Latin America and Southeast Africa and the Middle East, you will see companies start to take advantage of that, apart from tax and other benefits. So I think, we talk about these countries as being emerging markets. That's a nonsense. They've emerged. China is the second largest market in the world already, second largest economy in the world already. And India is close behind. South Korea is extremely strong. There are other markets like Pakistan, which I'm pretty bullish on despite the challenges it faces. Obviously, Singapore is a major talent hub, university hub, as was being pointed out, and increasingly we're going to see companies focus their activities there. So I think this is an irreversible shift. 200 years ago, BRICS and Next 11 accounted for 40% of worldwide GNP. They are soon to do so again, and there is very little, the balance of power is shifting in these areas such as education as well.
And in fact, the number of what we now call BRIC will expand, obviously.
Absolutely.
So those are some of the questions that we will talk about. Also, we'll ask this question: can the next Google emerge from Asia? We'll get to that conversation after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Singapore Sessions. With me are Craig Barrett, William Overholt, Victor Thao, and Martin Sorrell. am pleased to have them here to talk about this very important subject. And I come back to this as we listen to your opening remarks. What is it about the United States in technology that allowed it to be the place where a Facebook emerged, a Google emerged, an Intel emerged, a Hewlett-Packard emerged? What in a society allows that, promotes that, celebrates that?
I think you had 3 or 4 things. One is you had great research universities which were associated with the private sector, the MITs and the Stanfords. You had a huge consumer market, the biggest consumer market in the world for that sort of technology to take root. You also had the VC community, venture capital community, and if you combine that with a society where fear of failure is almost non-existent, that is, 3 failures give you a gold star on your resume, whereas in most countries, 1 failure blacklists you for the rest of your life. Those 4 things brought together made the Silicon Valley what it was, where Google or Facebook and Intel could grow and prosper. The challenge is, how do other countries replicate those 4 things? And they're 4 pretty different and unique aspects.
But you said it would be arrogant of the United States or any other place in the West to believe that we had a lock on that and that other cultures could not do that.
That's right. I'd add one other thing: immigrant culture. As I guess my grandparents came from Russia, Poland, Romania, if I remember, in the UK. So I'm sort of second generation. And one of the things that in the American context we've lost. I mean, we train, or in America we train lots of people from around the world, and then of course we don't give them visas to stay. So this is one thing that's going to work against us, and they go back. So I agree, the infrastructure, the capitalist system. But it's what's interesting about what's happening in China is it's state-directed capitalism. We've got a mixed system here, where the planners, who are all engineers, I think I'm right in saying that the 12 members of the Politburo are still all engineers, and brilliant engineers, and they plan extremely effectively. So we've got a mixed system, which post-Lehman we've shared in the West. But I do think there's something cultural about America that has made it strong. It's this nothing is impossible. To fail is not, I mean, in the UK, failure is a mark against you. You see that in Western Europe as a whole, whereas in America, it's not wrong to fail, and you can succeed.
I'll give you one statistic which I think is significant. Intel Capital, which is the venture capital part of Intel, is the biggest high-tech venture capital company in the world. It used to do about 90% of its investments in the United States, 10% outside. And initially, most of those outside investments were concentrated in Israel, very vibrant VC center. Today, if you look at Intel Capital investments, about 50% are in the U.S. and 50% are in Asia, primarily India and China. So when you look at the entrepreneurial character, the marketplace, the startups, the enthusiasm, the entrepreneurship, it is there and happening as measured by venture capital investments in the high-tech field.
Right.
And the reason it's going there is because the market is there, the developing demand is there, or what?
I think it's a combination that the Chinese market is growing, second largest economy, and also the Chinese education system is pretty good, and we do our part there not only by educating Chinese nationals and sending them home, but you can't go to a Chinese university today and not find 2 or 3 or 6 U.S. universities transferring their technology, their curriculum, their professors, syllabus to those Chinese universities. Our universities are doing a great export job, Charlie, taking the best, this crown jewels we have in the United States, our research universities, and transferring it lock, stock, and barrel to Chinese universities.
The one challenge, though, is one interesting challenge is we're talking to somebody in Beijing about this only yesterday, is that what do the billionaires in China do when they become billionaires? They take American citizenship or Canadian citizenship or non-Chinese citizenship because of this issue of what is going to happen in China in the longer term as people become richer, as the middle class becomes bigger. So the political issue, the stability issue in China is going to be the big issue that the government is going to have to deal with. So there are, it goes the other way too. I mean, what this chap was saying was, at the end of the day, there is great concern, because in addition to things like the 5-year plan, you have statements from the equivalent of the Speaker of the House in China that they are going to maintain the socialist system, and there is concerns about what is going to happen. So one of the reasons why America has been so successful is that private enterprise has been...
I agree with that. The other mitigating factor, though, is more and more of the foreign nationals who come to U.S. universities, and even though those that get H-1B visas or green cards and stay here for a while, are choosing to go back and take their technology, their capability back to India or China and apply it there, because they see opportunity there.
And the opportunity didn't exist in the past.
It exists.
So you can take that graduate education and take it back and apply it.
Well, I think this is a very important issue. We debate this a lot about, what are universities' responsibility and how do we actually to globalize. I think there's a fine balance between just giving everything away versus actually getting a lot in return, because they're human talent students that, in fact, we can retain in this country, an immigrant like myself, etc. So I do think it's a bi-directional issue, and you can't help but, in fact, like everything else, globalize. The issue is, in my opinion, is how to remain competitive, and how can we continue to have the best educational system and better than anywhere else. So your point, Craig, is well taken. I watched this because when I first came, people like myself would stay. But now, with the investment in China, in India, in Singapore, and investment in universities, the best scientists are going back there to say we're going to, bring the research to these universities as well.
Go back in part because of nationalism, and they go back part because the opportunity is there.
I think opportunity is more than nationalism, if you ask me.
But now that there's nationalism as an element to it, but because the opportunities are there, they can serve both instincts.
Right. This reflects the whole debate we had last week, in fact, about research funding in this country. Are we putting enough into education, into research, investing for the future? And there's a very complicated conversation about the government's budget. But I just want to point out that, in fact, China's investing a huge amount in this research and its university, and that's attracting some of the best scientists back.
One part of this conversation, William, is what has happened in Asia to bring the paradigm that we've all watched, which is, the shift, certainly, of economic growth at levels that are not matched in the West. What are those factors, and how do people in all of the region build on them?
There are a couple things. One is that after World War II, these countries that have been so successful were scared. And they said, we're going to do whatever it takes to grow our economy fast. I didn't care about whether it was democracy or authoritarian. Didn't care about whether it was Japanese tradition or something they borrowed from General Electric. Whatever it took, that's what we're going to do. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Singapore, Hong Kong. That set of priorities was crucial, and it led them to look out all over the world, and just whatever worked for economic development, you bring it back. That's what Japan has recently lost, and that's why it's declining. The second thing is this cultural value on education. You go to a Japanese high school or a Japanese university, the education isn't very serious. But after school, the parents send the kid to tutoring. And there's this one-on-one, hour after hour after hour, and the kid comes home, he gets checked on what he's done, and if he doesn't get A's, he's got a problem with his parents. And that pays off hugely.
This is one thing, I think it's been a big change since the Lehman crisis. I mean, I detect there was a feeling pre-Lehman, particularly in China and India, that there was a lot that they had to learn from the West. I think post-Lehman, there's a growing confidence, maybe even an overconfidence, but a growing confidence and a feeling that, you know, we messed up so badly, but what have we really got to learn? What have they really got to learn from us?
Go ahead.
I want to argue strongly that you don't see a state capitalism model that's proved itself able to be successful indefinitely. When people are scared, when they're supporting the leaders to take tough decisions and break all the ice, you get this 10% growth. And then when confidence and overconfidence set in, as it did in Japan in the mid-70s, you get this gradual decline and the interest groups take over. And if they don't move more toward our system, it stagnates, it decays, it's terrible. China just isn't there yet. They haven't faced the test. Places like Singapore have been so open to the world, and they continue to bring back the lessons of globalization. That can work, but the Chinese state capitalism model can't go on forever.
Let me come back to this argument and some other questions I want to raise when we have more of these Singapore sessions on Bloomberg Television. Back in a moment. Stay with us.
Marmara'yla kıtaları birleştiren dünya ticaretinin köprü ülkesi Türkiye hedeflerini yeniliyor. Duble yollarla yenilenen ve geliştirilen karayolu ağı, hızlı trenlerle alışkanlık kazandırılan demir yolları, rekabete açılarak ivmelenen havayolu taşımacılığı, gemi inşaat sanayi ve taşıma kapasitesi sayesinde dünya denizlerinde söz sahibi olma mücadelesi. Hedefler, amaçlar ve yönelimler. Sektörün geleceği, sektördeki gelecekçi yaklaşımlar. Bloomberg HT, ulaştırma, denizcilik ve haberleşme sektörlerini fokus altına alıyor. 4-14 Kasım arasında 11.30 ve 18.45'te Hande Demirel ve Ali Çağatay soruyor, sektör temsilcileri yanıtlıyor.
Birader niye bu? Olduğunda dersiz olduğunda.
Ne haber çocuklar?
Gel Kadir abi gel. Bizim birader bütün ekmekleri dağıttı. Bir laf tutturmuş. Neymiş? Olduğunda öde.
Aferin Ali. Esnaflığı çok iyi öğrenmişsin. Esnaflık böyle bir şey Nuri. Bugün biz onlara, yarın başkası bize.
Esnafımızdan öğrendik. Esnafımıza özel olduğunda öde kredisini hayata geçirdik. Kredinizi şimdi alın, bir yıl içinde olduğunda ödeyin. Tabii ki Akbank'lı KOBİ'de farklı.
Akbank'lı hep farklı.
Baban doğumunda en büyük heyecanı yaşayan oydu. Kaç yaşında olursan ol, o senin tek süper kahramanın. Peki şimdi bu adamcağız cepten gol pozisyonlarına bakmasın mı?
2 metre offside durdurdu.
Siz de annenizin babanızın telefonunu Vodafone'la internete bağlayın. Bu kolaylığı onlar da hak ediyor. Üstelik 500 megabayt Vodafone süper internet, denemeyenlere özel ilk ay bedava.
İmkansız gibi görünen şeyler başarılı. Tıpkı yeni CR-V 1.6 dizel gibi. Kendisi büyük, yakıt tüketimi düşük. Bazı şeyler göründüğü gibi değildir.
Habertürk'ten çocuklara 2 muhteşem yeni yıl hediyesi. Masalcı ayıcık ve masalcı köpek. Dünya masallarından en sevdiğiniz örnekleri onların sesinden keyifle dinleyin.
Kocaman bir sarayda güzel bir prenses yaşarmış.
İsteyene masalcı ayıcık, isteyene masalcı köpek. Her biri Habertürk'le birlikte sadece 39 kupona. İlk kupon yarın. Sakın kaçırmayın.
Tüm dünya cep telefonuyla fotoğraf çekiyor. İşte bu yüzden Nokia Lumia 1020 ilk önce kamera diyor. 41 megapiksel kamerası, devrim yaratan zoom teknolojisiyle yeni Nokia Lumia 1020. Uzak ara, en yakın. Nokia Lumia 1020 ilk kez ve sadece Turkcell'de. Üstelik Turkcell Platinum'a özel aksesuar teklifleriyle kapınızda.
Konfor konusunda bir uzman görüşüne ihtiyacınız varsa size şunu söyleyebilirim. Alarko kombiden şaşmayın.
Alarko kombi, gerçek kombi, gerçek konfor.
Welcome back. I'm Charlie Rose. The challenge we've taken up in the Singapore session, education and training in Asia. With us, Craig Barrett, William Overholt, Victor Zhao, and Martin Searle. And I begin with Craig Barrett.
I think the growth of the future is in kind of high-tech, biotech. Those are going to be small startups, and historically, those are the areas which are not regulated. Those are the areas where entrepreneurs come up with new ideas and grow great companies.
Okay, then is Asia, not just China, but Singapore and South Korea and India, all open to those kinds of ventures? And do they have the circumstances to allow them to flourish?
I think there's a lot more entrepreneurship going in places like China and India than we give them credit for today.
That's his point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, again, going back to conversation in Beijing, I met a guy, a very, very big venture capitalist. He has a network of people around China who mine and explore opportunities, almost commission men and women that go around China trying to find deals for him. And this is exactly in line with what you're saying, Craig. You go to Bangalore, you go to Beijing, you go to Singapore, you see young people trying to create new enterprise with immense vitality. I mean, I try and go to China, for example, 6 times a year. Why? Partly because everybody smiles. Everybody's enthusiastic, tremendous vitality, tremendous energy. You know, they haven't developed bad habits. And going back to your point, I guess the question is, when will China develop bad habits?
Yeah,
like us?
Take Singapore, for example, not in terms of not taken up in the Singapore session, education and training in Asia. With us, Craig Barrett, William Overholt, Victor Zhao, and Martin Searle. And I begin with Craig Barrett.
I think the growth of the future is in kind of high-tech, biotech. Those are going to be small startups, and historically, those are the areas which are not regulated. Those are the areas where entrepreneurs come up with new ideas and grow great companies.
Okay, then is Asia, not just China, but Singapore and South Korea and India, all open to those kinds of ventures? And do they have the circumstances to allow them to flourish?
I think there's a lot more entrepreneurship going in places like China and India than we give them credit for today.
That's his point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, again, going back to conversation in Beijing, I met a guy, a very, very big venture capitalist. He has a network of people around China who mine and explore opportunities, almost commission men and women that go around China trying to find deals for him. And this is exactly in line with what you're saying, Craig. You go to Bangalore, you go to Beijing, you go to Singapore, you see young people trying to create new enterprise with immense vitality. I mean, I try and go to China, for example, 6 times a year. Why? Partly because everybody smiles. Everybody's enthusiastic, tremendous vitality, tremendous energy. You know, they haven't developed bad habits. And going back to your point, I guess the question is, when will China develop bad habits?
Yeah,
like us?
Take Singapore, for example, not in terms of not in the technology area, but in terms of stem cell I mean, there's a country that understood the importance of a science of the future.
Yeah, I think this is, I agree with what's being said. You really need the convergence of a culture which has the ability of government to help and support research and enable the kind of entrepreneurism. You need research universities, you need investors, but also you need diversity and social tolerance. That's your point about immigrants. I think that convergence and then the willing to take risk is what makes the big difference. I think Singapore has it, or is beginning to have it, and I think there are clusters all over China. I quite agree with you. We see around the research-intensive universities the emergence of a biotech industry. And some of the investment in neuroscience and genome science is very impressive, what's going on in China. So I think, in fact, it is happening.
One of the old conventional wisdoms about Asia and the United States was that we educated young people differently, that our education was about teaching to be innovative and creative. This is a conventional wisdom.
Right.
Their education was more having to do with sort of rote memory and the ritual of education.
Right.
That's changing. That's no longer true.
Very much. When I was growing up, certainly that was the standard. And as Bill said about how you judge the success of an individual, we pay high social values around education, but the accomplishment. But now if you look at what's going on, particularly if I give you an example of a teaching a method that's developed in Singapore, which is actually better than what we have here. It's in our medical school, it's called Team Lead, where rather than sitting in classrooms and being taught about certain aspects of science or medicine, you actually do online learning, and you get team-based approach of problem solving. It's the real world. And so these methods are being, in fact, developed, not only introduced, but developed out there, and we actually transport some of them back to the United States. So there's, in fact, a lot of this kind of innovation going on.
Maybe we can learn something, and the rest of the world can learn something in terms of Asia as it experiences this extraordinary economic growth. Beyond universities, what else would you recommend if the leader of China, or leader of Singapore, leader of South Korea, leader of Japan would come to you and say, you know, how do we get there fast?
I firmly believe there are only three levers you have to pull. First one, most important, is education. Right. Second one is investing in new ideas, and that's what fraction of your GDP do you put into basic research and development. And that's an area where a lot of us have been vocal in the U.S., where the government contribution has fallen to about half of its previous investment level over the last 30 years in terms of percent of GDP that goes back into basic R&D, back into basic university investment.
But when you then look at things like alternative energy sources, things like high-speed rail, all of that, China has made is one example, significant government investment, yes?
Yes, and I think a lot of the rhetoric in America misses how important government investment has been here. Everything from the internet to Teflon came out of basically Defense Department sponsored research. But the thing I would add for China in particular is a legal and property system that allows people to keep and build rapidly on the fruits of their efforts. This is the key. In Silicon Valley, if you invent something, you get, first of all, this great venture capital funding. And secondly, you get all the support of the legal system for keeping your intellectual property and keeping the fruits you reap later on. Japan, Korea, especially Singapore, Hong Kong have achieved that. China has a long way to go. India's a little bit ahead of China, but they've got a ways to go too.
Yeah, but I mean, Martin and Greg and I all know
the Chinese are starting to do it. Yeah. I mean, at the sessions we had in Beijing the last couple of days, the Minister of Commerce and Finance and Industry both said that they were going to invest in brands. The 12th, 5-year plan is very focused on service industries and consumption, obviously, because they have to save less. Health safety net, a welfare safety net, invest in